Greetings, my name is Blazely Dragon, and today I wanted to talk about joining spiritual groups and religious groups, and some of the things that you may expect or possibly run into, as well as some of the stereotypes associated with some of these groups. Now, I don't know all groups out there, but I do know a couple that I've had interactions with, or have met individuals who practice. So I wanted to talk about a few of those. So let's go ahead and get started. And the very first one that I wanted to start with was one that's pretty well known, and that's Christianity. Now, when I say Christianity, of course, I mean a large group of monotheistic faiths that also incorporate Jesus Christ into their faith. So you're talking about Catholics or Protestants, Baptists. So some of the stereotypes that you'll typically hear or might experience that if you don't actually practice or follow their faith, then instantly you're going to hell, because the road to salvation is through their path. You'll also notice that a lot of them tend to say Bible, Bible, Bible. However, there tends to be many different versions of the Bible, and there's arguments over how the Bible should be read and interpreted, as well as which version of the Bible you should even read. Typically, when you try to join an organization, it's a Christian organization, a lot of them do seem to have very open arms for accepting new followers and practitioners because they're trying to save you. They want you to find salvation. And in their view, you are going to hell. You are damned if you don't go through salvation. However, sometimes there's also some stereotypes involved, and this is kind of hit or miss, and it depends on the individual, that if you don't follow their faith, you're instantly evil or satanic or, like I said, going to hell. It just depends on the person. I have met quite a few Christians, and there's some pretty extremes, and this maybe has to do with the fact that where I live in the States, that Christianity is pretty predominant for the most part. But you'll find individuals that are just complete whack jobs, that are just absolutely cruel, twisted, and it makes you think, really? But then I've met other individuals, they'll give you the shirt off their back. They're some of the nicest people I know are Christians. So it's kind of just hit and miss. Going on to the next one, although I guess you could technically also consider this within the Christianity umbrella, is Mormons. So Mormons, there's a misconception and stereotype that they're all polygamists, meaning they have multiple wives. I believe there is one group of polygamists that are also Mormon, but that doesn't mean all Mormons do that. That's actually a falsehood, and again, a wrong stereotype. Most of the Mormons that I've run into or spoken with are extremely nice and open. They try to help each other that are members of their same church or congregation. I don't know the proper term for it, but they will have their youth actually go out and do manual labor to help out folks in their community. They are always outgoing, smiling, and they'll talk to you about anything. Even if you don't follow their faith, they'll still come to your door and just want to talk to you and just have conversations about what you believe. If you do go to check out one of their church gatherings or groups, you're welcome to kind of sit and listen as an outsider and see if it's a right fit for you. And if not, there's no hard feelings. Next one on my list is one that's quite often very misunderstood, and that is Satanism. So a lot of folks think that if you are a Satanist, you're instantly believing in Satan. Believe it or not, there are different forms of Satanism. And at least the individuals that I've met that were Satanists, and I believe I've only met 3, they don't believe in Satan as an entity at all. It's a concept to them. The whole concept of Satan for them is about embracing what makes you happy in this world and answering to no one for it. Now, some of them might take it to an extreme. The ones I've met are not. They just want to live their life to the fullest. So interestingly enough, there's different sects of Satanism, and they can vary. Now, as far as joining one of their groups or organizations, I've never had any experience with that. I've never asked any of that, and the 3 that I met were solitary. I'm sure there's some extremists just like in anywhere else, but typically people think if they're Satanists, they're these evil, horrible, wicked people. And like I said, at least the ones that I've interacted with seem to be pretty well grounded. They just have a different approach and philosophy on life. Next on my list is Hinduism. Now, the interesting thing when it comes to Hinduism is you're going to have varying degrees as far as reactions when you try to join a Hindu community. I have met individuals who are very open and embrace anybody joining into Hinduism, but I've also met quite a few, especially even on the internet, that are very much about if you are not Indian, it's a cultural thing. So you can't become a Hindu. You're either born a Hindu or you're not a Hindu. Again, this is not shared with all of them. And then I've also had some varying degrees on what they consider their faith or practices to be. For example, some of them acknowledge the fact that with multiple gods and goddesses, they consider themselves polytheistic, while other ones swear up and down, no, they are monotheistic, period. They believe in one God who has many forms and shapes. So again, it just comes down to interpretation or impression. I've seen at least some of the individuals that I have spoken with, because I've worked with and spoken with quite a few folks that do follow the Hindu religion, that they seem to be very open to talking about it for the most part, but it's also very standoffish. Like I said, it's more of a cultural thing, it seems, and it seems very hard to get your foot in the door. I've not tried, so I don't know how difficult it is, but I have talked to a few individuals who have attempted, and they said they did not have very much success, and they were kind of looked at as outsiders. Next on my list is Native American spiritual traditions. And the reason I say it like that is it seems that there is a variance on spiritual traditions based upon tribe to tribe. So depending on which tribe you're with, depends on what spiritual traditions you might have. One of the individuals I was able to speak with, they actually said they don't actually have a name or a term for their spiritual practitioners. It's just part of their culture and it's part of their life. He actually referred to himself and the term which you would associate in some of the Western religions as a priest. He said his title was pipe maker, because they didn't really have a name for it. They just were. People just were spiritual. And some of them might have been more spiritual. You just knew who they were in your tribe or your community. Again, I can't speak for all tribes and communities, and I do not remember which tribe his was. However, again, that's one of those things, from what I've seen and experienced, it seems like you're either born into it or you're not born into it. They don't seem very accepting of outsiders. However, some of them love talking about it and sharing information, which I thought is pretty cool and I've appreciated. One of the stereotypes that's commonly associated with Native American spiritual traditions is folks think that the priest-like individuals, or in the case of the individual I mentioned, pipe maker, are called shamans. Shamanism actually comes from a different region, and even though some of the practices can be considered shamanistic, they actually don't typically refer to themselves as shamans. That's usually what Westerner folks will usually call them. The next one on my list is Buddhism. Buddhism actually has multiple forms. It actually originates from India and it is spread out to China, where it became Chan Buddhism, Japan, where it became Zen Buddhism, Tibet, where it became Tibetan Buddhism. There's many different forms of it. There's also large vehicle Buddhism and small vehicle Buddhism. And you will typically see individuals, at least here in the West, in the States, you'll typically see a lot of individuals who claim to be Buddhist, but only to a certain degree. Again, depending on the large vehicle or small vehicle Buddhism, and depending on how devout they get with it, whether they shave their heads and pray on a regular basis and practice a vegetarian diet and only pure, natural, healthy things and meditate with most of their day, there's also a very stringent rule system that is very difficult to follow, typically referred to as the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. This seems to be a hard concept for a lot of Westerners to adapt to. So when trying to join a Buddhist sect, it can be very difficult. However, applying some of the principles of Buddhism seems to be fairly well accepted with most Western cultures, and that's more of a solitary practice, and it's something that people will typically pick up from books. Now, sometimes they're fortunate enough to pick it up from a teacher as well, and even though some of these different paths and faiths have originated in certain countries, that doesn't mean they're not accepted elsewhere outside of it. You can still be a Chan Buddhist in the state or a Zen Buddhist in the States, for example. Interestingly enough, the Shaolin monks were actually Chan Buddhists. Next on my list is Taoism. Some people call it Taoism. Depending on how you want to pronounce it, it's not really as important. As I understand it, the proper pronunciation is Tao. So, Taoism. When it comes to Taoism, I think, again, it's one of those traditions that is very difficult to get into for the West. It seems to be deeply ingrained in Chinese folk tradition, and individuals who are outsiders are not always typically accepted into or taught the lessons of. Most of the books seem to be translated, obviously, from Chinese, and when you do find someone who's willing to teach you, the individuals that I've run into tend to be slightly arrogant. That's at least the ones that I've met, and they tend to be pretty devout in their practices. One person that I actually met online who was willing to teach actually wanted myself to give up all other practices and only focus on Taoism, otherwise they refused to teach me. Another individual that I spoke with said there's other religions to follow, there's no point in wasting your time. And I just thought it was very interesting that there was such a wall and restriction from trying to adjust or adapt to it. Now, you will find individuals in the States that refer to themselves as Taoists, but just like with Buddhism, you do find a lot of half-ass with that, where they just adapt some of the principles, such as Wu Wei Er Wu Bu Wei, or Wu Wei Wu, which essentially means action through inaction. It's about finding your natural state, or the state of Pu, which is this naturalness, where you're realizing that things are perfect on their own and you're not trying to force them to happen, but you allow them to happen and unfold on their own. Another common misconception when it comes to Taoist is folks think that yin yang, it's actually yin yang. They don't seem to understand the symbolism behind it, because there's a lot of Western concepts that are pushed into it. And in the root of Taoism, there's Taoism, the religion, and then there's Taoism, the philosophy. The philosophy seems to be fairly wide accepted and known. There's a lot of pretty good books on it, even stuff on YouTube and different videos that you can access. But finding an actual Taoist and becoming the Taoist religion and actually doing the practices and the ceremonies and the paper writing and the incense and the proper way to pray, that becomes a little bit more difficult. They have their own set of deities, gods and goddesses, and it's, again, very an intricate practice that is very, very difficult to even get a hold of or get wind of, because they tend to be in sects, and if you don't join a specific sect, you're pretty much not going to be able to learn their secrets. So again, very push off and standoffish to outsiders, unless you're just adapting some of the generalized principles. Another thing that's often a misconception is folks believe that this concept of qi is energy and it's life force, and that's not really the case. Again, you talk about a cultural difference to China. Qi, Jing, and Shen are three energies of the body. Jing is your physical body. Qi is like your breath, and it's like your energy that's like your will, your oomph through your body, whereas Shen energy is what you radiate off of you. So when individuals say that they're healing with their qi or pushing people with their qi, that's not really the case. You use your qi and your will and your intent in martial arts such as Tai Chi Chuan or some of the other Neidan internal arts, or even with the Qigong and stuff. But if anything is actually leaving your body to potentially heal or push something else, it'd probably be Shen energy. One way of interpreting this would be thinking about a candle. The wick itself and the wax would be your Jing energy. The fire and flame would be the Qi energy. And then the light and heat that come off of it would be the Shen energy. But again, this is sort of a hard concept for a lot of Westerners, at least in the States, to comprehend. And I'm not even saying I have a full comprehension of it. Then there's, of course, the idea and concept of the seven selves, which I won't even get into because I just wanted to briefly touch upon these and mention that Taoism doesn't seem to be very accepting of outsiders when you talk about it from a religious standpoint. Next on my list, vampires. Now, depending on the type of vampire, and yes, you're instantly going to start thinking about the fictitious vampire or some of the legends and stories of different types of blood-sucking monsters, so to speak. But there are actually individuals who consider themselves vampires, and typically a group of vampires is sometimes referred to as a coven. Yes, you'll also hear this with witches, but there actually are covens and groups of vampires that work and practice together. Some of their spirituality can be adapted to the way they go about feeding. Feeding can vary from psi vampires or psychic vampires who feed off of psionic energy. You can also have people who are just vampiric in nature that you feel very drained by being around. There's also the sanguinarian or the sang vampires who actually feed off of human blood. This is very controversial due to the fact that technically it's almost considered to be a form of cannibalism, and it's also something that's not exactly smiled upon in general culture. However, a lot of the vampires that do feed on blood say and claim that they actually need to feed off of human blood. Perhaps this is some sort of an iron deficiency. Perhaps there's more to it than we understand. Who knows for sure? I'm not going to claim either way. I'm just letting you know that it is a culture that exists. Those that do feed off of blood, though, do typically try to do it in a hygienic way. For example, they'll have specific donors who are tested and screened to make sure their blood doesn't have any diseases in it. And when they do draw it, they typically use like syringes or butterfly needles. Like they'll actually try to be safe with it and not just like bleed people out. The thing to keep in mind is like they're not people that are going around murdering people that are these vampires. These vampires as a culture or spiritual practice or however they choose to approach it are just individuals who so happen to feel the need to feed off of others. When it comes to try to join some sort of a vampire society, sect, coven, or group, typically It's going to really greatly depend on that group of individuals. Some of them, especially the ones that have adapted as a lifestyle more than a spirituality or way about it, will look at other vampires or people who consider themselves to possibly be vampires as possible kindred that they want to accept and embrace. So if you do find other individuals that might want to be a vampire and they find vampires, those vampires tend to be maybe standoffish or leery at first because, again, their practices can be questionable depending on who you speak with. But if they find out that you're legit and sincere about it, they usually are fairly welcoming. Just be aware that depending on the group that you get with, you can have some pretty extremists. You are talking about individuals who are trying to drain life force off of other individuals or trying to actually drink their blood. So again, just be aware of that, and you can find some pretty extremes in those scenarios and situations. Next on my list is paganism. Typically, the term pagan itself is sort of a reclaim of an old negative term that had to do with anyone that wasn't monotheistic. So it is used very broadly. There's a great variety of ways of practicing and the way that individuals will practice solitary or with groups. And you can call it contemporary paganism, modern paganism, neo-paganism. The fact of the matter is a lot of the modern practices that are calling themselves paganism, pagans that practice today are not directly related to those of the past. So even though you find a whole bunch of different stories that might not make sense to you, like I've heard individuals argue, oh, they slaughter animals and then there's blood rituals and things like that. Well, technically, if you go back to some of the tribal societies, sure, they might have drained the blood of animals, but guess what? They typically ate them afterwards too, and it was part of the feast. You know what you guys do today? You mass stockpile animals in the big warehouses, not letting them move or breathe, and then you mass slaughter and butcher them. So you want to complain about some bloodletting to your deities and then eating the animal afterwards as part of their butchering sacrifice, almost like praying at meals. Anyway, today, modern pagans, neo-pagans, contemporary pagans don't slaughter or butcher animals. And in fact, some of the ones that I've met are actually vegetarian or mostly vegetarian lifestyle, or they try to go for free-range animals. Some of the misconceptions around them is they instantly think that they're Satanist or evil, and that's just not the case. Pagans on a whole, most of them are just looking for a way to reconnect with the earth and nature itself and see their place within it and celebrate life with others. They celebrate the seasons and the holidays. Most pagans will either be polytheistic, where they believe in multiple gods and goddesses, or they'll be animistic, where they believe that there's a spirit and a life to all living creatures, plants, and animals, or they will be pantheistic, where they believe that nature itself is divine, or some sort of a combination of all three. You'll find typically a modern concept for most neo-pagans that they believe either all deity and all nature and all of existence is one great force. It's all interconnected beyond our understanding, and there are different faces and facets of it, and that's why you have multiple gods and goddesses. Some think of them as actual beings or spirits or entities. The term and word that they use to describe themselves can vary greatly, and it's typically an umbrella term that falls with a lot of other groups. So you might have different practices that individuals be considering as pagan practices, even though they're not using the term pagan for themselves. Some of the things that I would say to watch out for when trying to join the pagan community is, first of all, let me just say that this varies greatly depending on the individual, but you will find individuals who will be kind of arrogant or haughty and look down on others. They'll brag about the knowledge they have or how long they've been practicing for. They will claim that they're part of this ancient practice or group, when in reality, many of them end up being either book trained or just self-taught, which there's nothing wrong with that. If you're considering trying to join a pagan group, keep in mind, because of the variances on practices, that you might not necessarily see eye to eye. I've also noticed that some pagans, and this does not account for all of them, but some of the pagans that get into groups have a tendency to be individuals that were snubbed by society in some way. There's some form of an outcast. They're angry or upset with the religion they might have been raised with. So they'll try to kind of like strive out and become a rebel or an outcast, and this has a tendency to make many of them jaded, and also to assume that other individuals are going to be confrontational, so they try to be confrontational first. Again, this is not all pagans. I've also met a lot of pagans that are very mellow, laid back, really nice spiritual individuals that are just accepting of everyone and just love life. So you'll find a great deal of difference depending on the group you go with. Just be aware, and if you see signs of drama, maybe you should back out. Know that a lot of them will pretty much be accepting. Be aware, be leery, and keep people at a distance until you actually do trust them. Most pagans today seem to be eclectic. Eclectic applies to more than just spirituality. You can have an eclectic taste in music. You can have an eclectic taste in food. It just means you like a variety of things and you mix and match to what makes the most sense to you or to your own tastes. Next on my list is heathenism. Heathen. The misconception with heathenism is folks assume that if you're heathen, you're pagan, and they're interchangeable terms. Typically, folks like to distinguish between the two of them because of the tradition. Heathenism is typically some of your Scandinavian or Nordic traditions. And one of the very big distinctions between the way heathens practice versus pagans practice is heathens will typically work with their deities versus worship their deities. They see them as individual beings that they have a close friendship with. I'm not saying pagans can't do this. Depending on the individual you speak with, they might consider the terms interchangeable. Just be aware of that, especially if you're trying to get in with a community of heathens. Heathen, just like pagan, is a reclaimed term that had a negative innuendo in the past, and it's just something that people apply. A lot of the traditions that are Nordic or Scandinavian are traditions that have very specific revival movements associated with them, and typically if you find a heathen, in many cases they are following one of those revival movements specifically instead of the broader term one. They have a reverence for their ancestors, they have a reverence for nature and the natural world. Typically. I guess it depends on the individual once again. Another one of the misconceptions when it comes to heathenism is a lot of folks think it's neo-Nazism and white supremacy. That's just not the case. Typically, heathenry is actually broken up into subcultures, which have to do with the region or the country they come from for the revival movement, such as Ausatru, or Vanatru, or Foreign Said. The Foreign Said I might not be pronouncing correctly. Then there is the Anglo-Saxon revival movements, which is Fyrn Siddu and Theodism. Again, might be pronouncing those incorrectly. There's also the German one, which I believe is pronounced Irminism, which I could be pronouncing wrong. Then there's the folkish ones such as Odinism, or Vodinism, or Wodenism, or Odalism. It just, again, depends on the different tradition that they're doing. And a lot of these, again, are revival movements. Back in the day, you didn't really have, in these heathen type of countries, these Nordic Scandinavian countries, you didn't have words in a lot of the places that would distinguish the individual spiritual practice. It was just part of their society and their community. For example, if you look at Iceland, the chief, who also happened to be sort of like the priest of that group, that clan, that gathering of individuals, was called the Gothi. And the Gothi would universally apply to a priest or a chieftain. So it's kind of, again, it's not really separated as part of natural everyday life. Individuals would practice inside of their homes. So again, there's a lot of modern misconceptions. And the thing is, if you look back at the history of heathenism, it is separated from what we do today. We don't know a lot of the past. So these are revival movements, which a lot of folks want to argue about. So just be aware of that. So you could run into potentially some white supremacy groups. You could run into some individuals who are claiming it as a bloodline thing only, and you have to be of the bloodline. So when it comes to some of the groups that I have seen, it seems some of the heathens tend to be a little bit more severe or even more standoffish because they don't want to attract those types of people. In Iceland, Ausatru has been separated from the rest of the world. That is the Icelandic revival movement. They're doing their own thing because they don't want to be associated with that. And you'll see that with a lot of the groups. They'll be very standoffish if you try to approach them or learn from them. A lot of the groups that I've reached out to, very from a distance, they'll give you information, but they're very resistant to having new members join for that reason, because they want to have that separation. They don't want to have that association with something that is just, let's face it, not good. Regardless, when it comes to heathenism, just be aware that you don't have to be of the blood. You don't have to be Scandinavian or Nordic in ancestry to pursue and try to practice some of the revival movements, and there's plenty of different ways of learning about it. Next on my list, I'm going to put together, and that is both witches and Wiccans. Now, the reason I'm putting these two together is because so many individuals don't realize they're two completely separate groups. The reason I'm clumping them together, however, is there are some similarities in the fact that Wiccans will tend to practice witchcraft. However, not all witches are Wiccans. So yes, a lot of Wiccans are witches. Most witches that I've met, that I've spoken with, are not Wiccan. So the two groups, again, you will have some misconceptions on what they are. Wicca, there's no evidence that I've been able to see anywhere that says that it's an ancient tradition or practice. It's a New Age revival movement that a lot of people argue about. They'll say it's from the dawn of time and stuff. If you look up some of the root words on the etymology, there is witcha and witche are the root word for where witch comes from, which is why folks will try to say they're the same thing. I don't want to spend time going on to the difference between the two. I have videos on it, and I can do it in separate videos if we would need new ones. But some of the things to keep an eye out for is you'll have individuals who try to claim one way of practicing when there is some variances from coven to coven. And both Wiccans and witches do use the term coven typically when they talk about a circle of magic users who practice their art or their religion together. Wicca does have a tendency to be more religion-based, where witchcraft itself is more magic spirituality-based. When it comes to witches and Wiccans, again, I've seen a lot of extremes. I've seen some very open, honest, nice, friendly people. However, I've also seen some very judgmental assholes in the community. It seems like more often than not, it seems to be the Wiccans that I've run across are typically, and this is not always the case, again, there's always exceptions, but a lot of the ones that I've met are individuals who are seeking. They don't know what to call themselves, so they call themselves Wiccan because they don't know what else to find out there. And it's one of the most predominant paths that a lot of folks can find. You'll see a lot of them, too, that want to prove themselves, and they'll wear these huge pentacles or pentagrams around their neck and announce to everyone that they're Wiccan, and they will sometimes be referred to as fluff bunnies because they go out of their way to fluff up everything and make it very obvious that they're Wiccan, and they want to announce it and scream it to the hilltops that they are. Then again, you'll also find very centered, honest, good Wiccans that just have it as part of their life and daily practice. It's just who they are. Again, there's just some variances. So be aware of that when you're approaching a group or wanting to learn from a group, where they may have learned from, what they're trying to teach, and what some of their principles are. You'll find the same thing with groups of witches. You'll find that solitary witches tend to like to stay solitary, but if they are in a group or in a coven, they tend to be very secretive and reserved about their practices, and although they'll accept you in time, there will be a level of trust you have to earn, which should be, especially if you're going to be doing magical practices with individuals. You'll hear tons of arguments when it comes to witches or Wiccans over the origin, how old it is, which gods they're allowed to worship, or should be able to worship, or not. That's the interesting thing. When it comes to Wicca, there actually is a set god and goddess for it, but a lot of individuals will pick and choose. Just watch out for the drama. Watch out for who you're coming into contact with, because some individuals, regardless of what they practice, can be very venomous and toxic. Last but not least on my list is Druidry. When it comes to Druidry, it is a modern revival movement. It's neo-Druidry. It's modern Druidry. Again, there is not an association with the ancient Druids of the past. A lot of that was lost. We have some of their lore and stuff today, but a lot of it has been reconstructed. As far as I know, there are two major groups when it comes to Druidry. One is one that I'm a member of, which is OBOD, Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. This is a revival movement that's been going on for at least the last 300 years. They've pieced some things back together and did a recreation of this new modern practice. It's a spirituality, can go with anything. You can be a Christian Druid, a Buddhist Druid, a Hindu Druid. It doesn't matter. You can apply the principles anywhere, or you can just be a Druid, period, and have it as a religious practice. So that's kind of an interesting take. The other one is called a Druid Fellowship, and I'm going to butcher the other pronunciation for it, but they're called ADF. Arndrachtfane. Again, I'm probably saying that incorrectly, but it is a Druid group from the States, and theirs is a religious practice. It is a religion the way that they teach it and incorporate it. One thing to keep in mind, Druidry is not Wicca. There is a lot of similarities in some ways and fashions because it's a nature earth-based faith. It is something that technically falls under the term of paganism, depending on how it's practiced, especially if it's a spiritual practice. But when it comes to approaching Druids, I have found, again, very similar to some of the other polytheistic groups, that you tend to find individuals who get arrogant or fool themselves, look down on others, and talk to you in a very demeaning way, which I find very frustrating. A lot of them will be very open and want to accept you. As I'd mentioned with OBOD or ADF, they're very accepting. They'll allow any member to start joining and learning and reading the material, and then they will have study groups or seed groups, or groves, which a grove is a group of druids or gathering of druids. It can also refer to a sacred space where they gather at. So they do tend to embrace new members fairly easily to start sharing the wisdom and knowledge, because I think most of them seem to want to have others learn and accept and see the place that is part of being human in this world, part of Earth, part of nature. So you'll find a lot of acceptance from a lot of these groups. Be aware that you're always going to find, no matter what group you go into, you're going to find your jerks, and they exist in Druidry as well, just like they exist anywhere else. But when you find someone who lives Druidry rather than practice Druidry, you will find some of the most relaxed, calm, spiritual people that are just very open and accepting to all people of all walks of life, and are just very happy and calm people to be around. So that's my list of a few of the different paths out there that I wanted to at least bring up, different things that you can expect, different types of drama that you might see, some of the stereotypes involved or associated with them. Obviously, that was a long list. Thank you for sitting through and watching the whole thing. Leave your comments below with some of the experiences that you had with some of these groups, or some of your thoughts on some of them, or maybe you practice one of these and maybe you agree or disagree with some of the points that I have brought up. Either way, thank you for watching. Remember to thumb up, like, and subscribe, and more videos coming your way.